May I just say that I don't think in 15 years heard as sophisticated a description of a period of my life between 1983 and 1990 as the one that you've just provided this evening. It was practically like traveling back in time, Vincente, to be able to hear that particular description. So thank you very much for that. And thank you to the Fundación for what has already proven to be a most interesting day. And I sincerely hope that I don't disappoint you all deeply this evening in respect of drawing it to an appropriate conclusion. It's a difficult topic, this one, and I decided for the purpose of this that I would do something that I never do. As those of you who know me, and there are some few in the room who do, I don't have any particular difficulty speaking extemporaneously. But this evening I'm not going to speak extemporaneously, largely because I would like to leave behind a text that reflects what I think is a considered view on this particular challenge. And the challenge, Vincente has already expressed it very cogently, but the challenge is to think about what the limits to collective action are in the context of conditions of complexity. So the proposition behind this is that we face a highly complex environment because of the scale of collective action that we have chosen to engage in, not only on a global scale, but also on regional scales, familiar to everyone who has been grappling with the challenges of European governance over the course of the past several years. And one of the difficulties that I think we haven't wrapped our minds around adequately is the proposition that there may be scales beyond which collective action in respect of complex issues is impossible. And therefore determining what appropriate scales are for what collective action problems in the context of governance is an important inquiry. I'm going to deal with some of the technical aspects of that tomorrow with a group of more technically oriented people, but for the purposes of this evening, I'm going to do my best to outline the challenge in a coherent way. So, let me leap in. In a remarkable poem entitled The Second Coming, that many of you will be familiar with, which he composed in 1919, immediately after the First World War, William Butler Yeats described his sense of the European circumstance at that point. And I'm going to quote a portion of the first stanza. Turning and turning in the widening gyre, the falcon cannot hear the falconer. Things fall apart. The center cannot hold. Mere anarchy is loosed upon the world. The blood-dimmed tide is loosed, and everywhere the ceremony of innocence is drowned. The best lack all conviction, while the worst are full of passionate intensity. And for those of you in respect of whom images of Donald Trump suddenly leap to mind, you're forgiven. I don't need to remind anyone here this evening of the disastrous clash engendered by the Bolshevik Revolution in Russia in 1917 and the rising German nationalism sharpened by the reparations payable that were imposed on the Weimar Republic after the Treaty of Versailles. The disastrous German hyperinflation of 1923, the Brüning austerity program of 1930 to 1932, and in the aftermath of the global financial crash, which obviously deepened both unemployment and forced deflation and triggered the rise of Adolf Hitler and National Socialism in Germany, other forms of fascism in Southern Europe, and the Second World War itself, Britain, Bolsheviks, foreign bankers, speculators, and Jews were stirred into a bubbling cauldron of fear and hatred in Germany that visited an extraordinary catastrophe on Europe, and indeed the world, and culminated in the use of atomic weapons by the United States to force the surrender of Japan and the division of Europe into NATO and the Warsaw Pact. There are echoes, unfortunately, of that time in the currents of the present, with narrow-minded actors again pursuing their selfish dreams or tortured fears, heedless of their effects on others. It is a disconcerting moment, so soon after our celebration of the 25th anniversary of the destruction of the Berlin Wall, accelerating the collapse of the USSR, the Warsaw Pact, and the Comecon. The continent of Europe was racked by two tragic events in March: a suicide bombing on a shopping street in Istanbul and its eastern extremity on March 19th, and two terrorist incidents in Brussels, 2,185 kilometers to the west by a Great Circle track, on March 22nd. Even without deep insight into the psychological profiles of the perpetrators, one can say with reasonable certainty that they sought to bring down an order that they revile, and that they were persuaded that their ends justified their horrific means. Recent experience of urban terrorism in Europe include the tragic events in Paris on November 13, 2015, London on July 7, 2005, and of course the train bombings in Madrid on March 11, 2004, which killed 191 people and injured nearly 1,800 in the bloodiest terrorist attack in European history. Well before any of us had heard of Al-Qaeda, however, or the Islamic State or Daesh, Londoners had suffered at the hands of the IRA, Madrileños and others in Spain from the attacks by the ETA, and Romans and other Italians from those of the NRA. According to the Global Terrorism Database, over 16,000 terrorist attacks have taken place in Europe since 1970. Most, it's worthwhile recording, in the decades of the 1970s and the 1980s. And the European experience greatly understates the tragedy of humanity. Baghdad, Mosul, and Ramadi are recorded as the most terrorism-prone cities, while Afghan, Egyptian, Libyan, Nigerian, Pakistani, and Somali cities are far more vulnerable to devastating violence than any in Europe or the United States. The tragedy of Syria is etched in our minds at present. And while all surely know that Lebanon, Jordan, Indonesia, and many other cities throughout the Muslim world, rather than any in the West, have borne the brunt of jihadi terrorist violence in the past decade. And terrorism is only one of a range of systemic challenges confronting us today. Indeed, terrorism is a symptom rather than a cause. Other matters of great concern to us, the flood of migrants into Europe from North and West Africa, the Levant and Afghanistan, the high youth unemployment and repressed demand and low, even negative interest rates throughout the advanced economies, the hoarding of unprecedented levels of cash and liquid instruments by corporations, and the rise of irresponsible single-issue political populism in many Western polities are all symptoms of a number of underlying causes. We need to understand and to address those causes if we're to improve both security and welfare. Meanwhile, many, and perhaps most global problems, from climate change to resource depletion, from pollution to biodiversity loss, from banking crises to sovereign debt crises, from the implosion of fragile states to the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction, are properly to be understood as collective action problems, arising from divergent interests, the inconsistent application of ostensible universal values, and violent socio-cultural clashes. As the human footprint on our planet, moreover, continues to grow, with members of a larger population impacting increasingly on one another and on the environment in which we're embedded, and as the greatest technological transformation since the end of the 18th century forces the reinvention of both employment and education, and raises profound ontological and epistemological questions about what it means to be human, we must find ways to bridge these gaps or face the consequences that Yeats laid out. The pursuit of rational self-interest in free markets, the Western operational paradigm since the 1980s, does not lead to socially desirable outcomes in such cases. We need solutions in which the aggregate benefits to humanity will exceed the aggregate costs, even if the cost exceeds the benefit for a limited period in individual cases. In a highly interconnected and interdependent world, we need solutions that can plausibly work to the advantage of most in the generations now alive, without destroying or appreciably diminishing the welfare of those who will follow us. So let me explore the implications of that this evening in 10 propositions. The first one, the need to manage systemic global risks and to advance global social goods demands better global governance. But the collective action problem becomes patent and acute well before we address alignment of the interests of 193 member states of the United Nations. As tensions in the European Union and even the Eurozone have made clear, divergent interests and misaligned values can frustrate wise decisions in the interests of all at much smaller scales. The tension between the political accountability of national leaders to their citizens and the need for restraint in the interests of collective welfare and intergenerational equity inhibits and can vitiate success. As Garrett Hardin pointed out in 1968, multiple individuals acting independently, rationally consulting their own self-interest, will all too often deplete a shared limited resource, even when it is not in anyone's long-term interest for this to happen. Current events, from the global financial crisis to looming geopolitical challenges to the risk of inflection points if we transgress planetary boundaries in climate, fresh water, biodiversity, and ocean acidification, reinforce the urgency of our need to act. The second proposition. The global order of the second half of the 20th century was crafted after World War II, premised on a normative system based on Western values, which their protagonists claimed to be universal. In that proposition, they were in fact the products of Western cultural and intellectual tradition, reinforced by the economic principles born of the Industrial Revolution and enforced by the superior firepower of Western armies and navies, both during and after the 19th century. The pillars of global governance, the United Nations and its specialized agencies, the Bretton Woods institutions, and the General Agreement on Tariffs and Trade, later translated into the World Trade Organization, were all crafted on the basis of the needs, interests, and norms of the victorious powers, notably the United States and the United Kingdom. While these norms were challenged by the USSR, the doctrine of mutually assured destruction provided a meta-framework that enabled coexistence until the Soviet Union imploded in 1991. The third proposition. The sense that Western economic and political norms, defined by Francis Fukuyama as liberal markets and liberal democracy, had triumphed after the implosion of the Soviet Empire, fueled the ethos of globalization and the myth that we were living in a global village. Commenting shrewdly at the time, Henry Kissinger said, "For the third time in the 20th century, America proclaimed its intention to build the new world order by applying its domestic values to the world at large. And for the third time, America seemed to tower over the international stage." Proposition 4. Aggressive assertion of the Anglo-Saxon thesis of globalization brought an Hegelian antithesis, which both challenged the merits of an integrated global economy that would produce a flat world and asserted the importance of other ethno-cultural and religious identities to challenge the homogenization of humanity in an Anglo-Saxon guise. The anti-globalization movement, spawned by the World Social Forum, which peaked at Porto Alegre, having hurled invective and Molotov cocktails at the neoliberal paradigm and its proponents, and demanded the abolition of Bretton Woods institutions. Greater assertiveness by developing world polities in opposing US and EU proposals at the WTO conference in Cancun, and the institutionalization of the G20 and the BRICS reflect the more constructive thrust of this movement. Meanwhile, as you can see behind me, the rise of Islamic fundamentalism reflected the renaissance of subnational and transnational identities in a globalizing world, in reaction to a widespread sense of economic exclusion and cultural appropriation. The institutionalization of the BRICS is another, more constructive example of the same trend. The fifth proposition, recognizing the need for change in the face of this backlash, we've tried to modify the structure of our social institutions. Change is needed to both the structure and the systems of global governance, because the changes wrought to the interstate system by decolonization, globalization, and global supply chains, and to the international system by broadcast and telecommunications technologies, the internet, the World Wide Web, social technologies, and global finance. The global recession brought a new urgency to this. The comforting fiction of a global village has been exposed as intellectual dross. Much of the global economy has been integrated, but the world has neither the sense of community that defines a village, where individuals serve both their personal needs and the collective interest, nor does it have the representative polity that would square the circle between economy and society to enable the global economy to meet the needs of all. The sixth proposition, the G8 lack the capacity, and the G7 much less, to shape the world economy. Global growth and aggregate wealth have shifted toward the emerging economies. By 2025, the largest emerging market countries will, by forecast, account for more than half of global growth. Companies from these markets will have joined those from the United States, Germany, and Japan in driving globalization. And the international monetary system will in all likelihood not be dominated by a single currency. The inclusion of the renminbi in the IMF basket is a first step in respect of this. The global growth economies are creating new opportunities in lower income developing countries through South-to-South investment and trade. The choice of the G20 to contain the financial crisis, however, has had limited success. At the summit in April 2009, the leaders of countries representing 4/5 of global GDP and 2/3 of the global population stood with their backs to the wall and united to prevent the global financial system and its economy imploding. But by the Toronto summit of June 2010, their unified purpose had evaporated. And the summit at Seoul in November that year was wrecked by deep disagreements about China's exchange rate policy and the effects of the second round of quantitative easing by the US Federal Reserve. The seventh proposition. This significant shift in economic power from the Atlantic eastwards has had important geopolitical consequences. The military campaigns in Afghanistan and Iraq overstretched the resources of the greatest Western military powers, failed to produce decisive outcomes, and unintentionally changed the balance of power in the area between the Eastern Mediterranean and Central Asia, paving the way for the Arab revolts. Widespread sectarian struggles were exacerbated by geopolitical competition, eventually prompting Russian intervention in Syria and waves of refugees and economic migrants into the European Union. Washington's smaller military footprint in the Middle East after 2014 and success in the P5+1 in negotiating the Joint Comprehensive Agreement on Iran's nuclear program cries out for comprehensive economic and security arrangements between states on the Arabian Peninsula, the Levant, across the Gulf, and in the Caucasus and Central Asia. There is an urgent need in East Asia for comprehensive arrangements between Japan, China, Russia, and the Koreas. Current tensions in the South China and East China Seas associated with China's rise and on the Korean Peninsula due to Pyongyang's determination to press ahead with nuclear and ballistic missile tests make clear the risks of failure. The eighth proposition. Efforts to implement meaningful changes to the structure of global institutions and the systems by which they interact have failed in the past and will fail in future unless we clarify and reach agreement on the ends we seek and the norms by which the new system will be governed. These norms must be adequate to meet the challenges of global governance, and they must respect the diversity of cultures and values that characterize humanity. Just expressing it in that way makes clear how difficult it will be. The ascendance of Asian powers with deep reservoirs of historical experience and literate high cultures makes challenges to the norms of international exchange imposed over 2 centuries of Western dominance understandable and indeed inevitable. China's history is not that of Western Europe. The complexity of the social and economic systems we've created and the nonlinear ecosystems in which we're embedded exceed our understanding and our ability to manage their workings. This has exposed our policy weaknesses, undermined acceptance of Western norms, and encouraged emerging powers to rely on their own cultural precepts to manage their economies and societies and conduct their international relations. It has also put Western polities under considerable domestic stress, further lowering participation in national elections throughout Western Europe and the United States, and fueling the rise of alternative parties and populist anti-establishment candidates. Surveys of the opinions of millennials, those with birth years from the early 1980s to the early 2000s, suggest disenchantment with both the political systems of their elders and the values that these reflect. A new normative framework comprising the rules by which states will be bound will have to take account of the values of different cultures and the interests of leading states. Ninth proposition. Culture is the context for the social production of meaning. The phrase comes from Clifford Geertz, and it's an extremely important insight into the meaning of culture. It is the context for the social production of meaning. The diversity of values in different societies is well known, but so is the similarity of some. Security, dignity, opportunity, justice, equity, and sustainability are widely represented as important values across cultures, although they take different forms in all. All societies discourage behavior that damages social harmony. Bravery and empathy are almost universally admired, probably because they promote evolutionary fitness. Successful societies over millennia have found near their peaks and kept until their declines particular balances between individual rights and freedoms which are necessary to enable creativity and innovation, acceptance of the obligation of each individual to contribute to the good of the society of which he or she is a part, and recognition of the need to respect the ecosystem on which all depend for their survival. This last point, respect for the ecosystem, is aligned both with individual fitness and social benefit, not least because it reduces the likelihood of a tragedy of the commons. So restoring balance between individual rights and freedoms, responsibility and accountability to the community, and respect for the ecosystem on which we depend is thus essential. We're not exclusively individualistic, rational, and selfish, despite the distorted version of Adam Smith's more nuanced wisdom put about by market ideologues in the past 3 decades. Collective action in the common good, motivated by compassion to complement reason, is feasible and necessary for social survival. Indeed, the pull of social empathy, the bonds between mother and child, siblings and families, has been the foundation of societies over millennia and serves as the counterweight to the evolutionary efficient neurochemical urges triggered by fear and want, which prompt so much other human behavior. And the 10th and last proposition: we cannot simply assert a canon of norms for global governance. If we could solve the problem very quickly, but we can't. A global society, in Hedley Bull's formulation, comprises a group of states conscious of common interests and common values that conceive themselves to be bound by a common set of rules in their relations to one another. We can either achieve that or we can't. If we can have a system of global governance. If we cannot, it is impossible. The challenge is thus to clarify the interests and values that we have in common and to define a set of rules that all can accept in shaping interstate behavior and in guiding our efforts to address the global commons. Through one of our foundations, the FutureWorld Foundation, we've launched an inquiry across major cultures to define the perceived national interests and values that frustrate international agreement and the global norms that we need for effective governance. To address this, we're focused on 5 global challenges: delivering socially inclusive and environmentally sustainable economic growth, for without this we shan't be able to achieve anything else; reducing poverty and improving equity, because exceptional prosperity for the few at the expense of the many is neither morally justifiable nor politically sustainable; addressing the sources of global, national, and human vulnerability to promote security, for security underpins both community and progress; sharing the norms and values that enable global coexistence and working to reconcile while respecting cultural differences, because respect for core human values and acceptance of universal norms is necessary to allow us to live in harmony, while appreciation of the value of cultural diversity enriches both our understanding and our prospect for evolution. And lastly, improving the quality of global governance and its institutions, for most of the challenges that we face in a highly connected world cannot be resolved in any other way. These 5 challenges comprise an appropriate agenda on a global scale and frame the paradigm for both global governance and collective wisdom at different scales. We should err greatly, however, if we were to imagine that all problems can be resolved on a global scale. The past 7 years of Europe's painful experiences made that abundantly clear. Spain's own history provides a further graphic example. Human identity is complex and multifaceted, and everyone here this evening has and acts in accordance with several identities. These range in scale from the individual through those of family and clan to regional and national identities, perhaps one associated with religion, and eventually at higher levels of abstraction, a European identity, or even that of a global citizen, a human being, or a child of God. Any challenge requiring collective action can thus only be addressed successfully at a scale at which the persons who must agree to act in concert share a common appreciation of their interests and the values in accordance with which they will agree to act. This does not require an identity of interests or suggest precisely the same hierarchy of values. But all human experience would suggest that too great a diversity of perceived interests or appreciably divergent values will frustrate agreement. Our endeavor, if we wish to solve this problem and achieve what Manuel has referred to many times in the last 24 hours as the next equilibrium, can only be achieved if we define the focal areas for transnational governance, clarify the interests and the values that frustrate collective action at those levels, and define normative frameworks that can overcome these barriers at different transnational scales. Transforming collective human behavior by refocusing individual actions and those of national governments away from behaviors that would be expected if we were all exclusively individualistic, rational, and selfish, to more balanced policies that reflect the merit and utility of actions informed by collective interest and social empathy, will only succeed, however, if we recognize and understand the variety of interests and values that have prevented cooperation emerging spontaneously, and if we focus our efforts on defining and establishing the norms that enable collective action at appropriate scales. This is an endeavor, I'd suggest to you all, that is worthy of great minds, great spirits, and great hearts, of the sort that the Fundación Rafael del Pino has assembled in this room this evening. We must reach out to remarkable persons in other parts of the globe as well, to engage with them in this project. There's no guarantee of success, but if we approach it in a measured way, with a sense of determination tempered by humility, it is attainable, and it is certainly imperative. Thank you very much.